cooperate. Girl, black chicks like you, always stealing, scheming, destroying. Darren, a low-tier security grunt, barked as he tore through Imani Carter's bags in first class, humiliating every black passenger in sight. But what he didn't know, Imani is the daughter of Jerome Carter, CEO of Skywave Airlines, the man who can erase Darren's career with one phone call. What state are you in? Ever met a Darren like this where you live? Stick around till the end to see the price of ignorance and racism. Imani rolled her suitcase smoothly behind her, the click of her heels echoing against the polished tiles of JFK Airport's security checkpoint. Everything was in order, passport in hand, a first-class ticket, a calm and composed demeanor. She had just landed from Chicago and offered a polite smile to the attendant as she entered the priority lane. There was nothing inappropriate in her behavior, yet the cold, lingering stare of the security officer ahead settled on her longer than necessary. Darren Kessler, a tall white man in a TSA uniform, didn't glance at any other traveler. She didn't need to turn around to know others were behind her, but he chose her. He stepped forward, raised his hand as if making a neutral gesture, but his voice was sharper than the metallic screech of the scanner. "You, step aside," he barked, offering neither explanation nor courtesy. Imani tilted her head slightly, her tone soft but steady. "I've already been screened in Chicago, and this is a first-class ticket." She extended the neatly folded document, as orderly as everything else in her life. Darren didn't even glance at the ticket. His eyes remained fixed on her, as if her presence alone confirmed all his suspicions. "Random check. Black girls often smuggle untaxed goods," he said curtly, then motioned for her to follow, a vague phrase used when the real reason wasn't to be named. She entered the secondary inspection area, where a few other passengers stood waiting, but none were scrutinized the way she was. Darren didn't ask for permission before opening her suitcase. His hands were rough, flipping through clothes, pulling out personal items with complete disregard. A perfume bottle slipped from his fingers and rolled across the floor. A silk scarf followed, sliding out silently. A small framed photo, carefully wrapped in cloth, tumbled from a side pocket. Imani stood still, her hands gently holding her purse, eyes following every item as if she were witnessing a violation that needed no words. He didn't have to do this. Darren's every move felt like a deliberate attempt to tear away the layers of dignity she carried from one city to another. "You're spilling my things," she said, her voice hoarse but unwavering. There was no anger, just truth. Darren didn't reply, only cast her a quick glance before continuing to rummage, as though determined to find something that could justify his original suspicion. She bent down to retrieve the perfume, wiping dust from the bottle. The scarf was now wrinkled. As she reached for the framed photo, Darren yanked the suitcase again, slamming it into a nearby metal post. Imani paused, her gaze falling on the photo. A black man in a dark suit, his smile gentle, his eyes kind even through the glass. Darren stood upright as if completing a necessary task, but the slight smirk on his lips betrayed a deeper intent. Imani looked directly at him, unflinching. "If your concern is the color of my skin, I suggest you say it clearly. If this is just a routine inspection, then you should know how to leave people's belongings intact." He didn't reply right away. His eyes went from her to the photo, then back. In that moment, she knew she wasn't being profiled for security. She was an anomaly, someone who didn't fit the image he believed belonged in a first-class seat. "You seem to know the law," he muttered, locking the suitcase. "Good. You'll need it. Black people break the rules here a lot. Better know how to explain yourself when we catch you," Darren sneered. Imani didn't react. She picked up the scarf and folded it neatly. Her eyes never left him, as if waiting for something to crack through the arrogant mask, not to fight back, but to remember, because something bigger was unfolding from this very moment. The suitcase sat tilted on the edge of the inspection table, one flap wide open, its zipper off track. The perfume had shattered, the scent drifting faintly through the checkpoint, unable to cover the thickening tension. She bent down to place the photo back inside the wrinkled silk, her hand freezing at the sight of a long scratch across the glass. "You've damaged my belongings," she said, lifting her head, her voice calm enough to make people behind her turn. "I've said this clearly. You can check, but don't break what doesn't belong to you." Darren didn't respond. He slammed the suitcase shut, breath quickening, eyes fixed on the woman before him as if her composure was a personal insult. He shoved the suitcase to the floor and stomped hard on the crumpled fabric. A loud crack rang out as the plastic wheel and metal axle snapped. Imani stepped back slightly, meeting his gaze. Her jaw tightened, lips pressed together, but her eyes didn't waver. She didn't scream. The rage was contained, funneled into her words. "I believe we're now clear that this was never about my luggage. I'm a VIP passenger with a valid ticket and appropriate belongings," she said, each word sharp as glass. "If your way of asserting authority is to crush someone's dignity, I'm afraid you're wearing the wrong uniform." "Oh," Darren smirked, but his eyes revealed the sting of being challenged. Overreactions usually mean guilt. "Are you hiding something?" She bent down, picked up the scratched photo, and wiped it with her sleeve. "I'm hiding nothing. That man in the picture is my father. What you just stepped on are the things I brought home after 7 months away from my family." He crossed his arms, gaze still cold. "I've followed protocol. You're being disruptive. I can detain you." "Disruptive?" she repeated, voice level. "You call this a disruption. I call it conversation. I'm not shouting, not resisting. I'm requesting basic respect owed to any citizen." Darren pulled out his inspection notebook, glanced at it, then shut it decisively. "Then cooperate. Girls like you, I've seen plenty, always bending rules, always stealing something. Don't try to prove anything to me. Around here, I decide whether you move forward or not." The air now was thicker than ever. One side a man soaked in prejudice, ready to crush those he viewed as weak, convinced she was easy prey. On the other hand, Imani is a woman who dared to demand justice. What happened next would leave Darren shaken. Imani glanced at her phone, took it out, and unlocked it. Her eyes didn't leave Darren's face as her fingers moved across the screen. Her voice was calm, but strangely cold. "I will call my father." There was a pause. Darren blinked. "Your father? What for? Is he a lawyer or something?" he asked, half laughing, half sneering. Imani lifted her head, delivering her answer squarely into the space between them. He's the reason you still have a job at this terminal." Darren froze, still gripping his inspection notebook, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. For a brief moment, the confidence vanished. He let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it, only mockery. He shook his head slowly, like someone hearing the most ridiculous thing all day. "Your father, huh? So we're playing the I know someone game. I've seen them all, but this one still makes me laugh," he said, stressing each word without raising his voice, though the tone was enough to dampen the air around them. Imani didn't respond. She stood straight, holding her phone tightly, her gaze as steady as a silent lake. The man in front of her might believe a few sarcastic lines could win him the moment, but she wasn't here to play that game. She didn't watch him retreat, but shifted her gaze towards someone else who had been watching from the beginning. Min Tran stood behind a side counter meant for inspecting handheld electronics and handbags. He hadn't participated in the confrontation, but his eyes hadn't left the scene for even a second. No one noticed him. He kept the quiet presence he'd learned after years in a system where speaking too much could make someone disappear from the next shift. He recognized that look, not Darren's, but Imani's. It was the same look that once stared back at him in the mirror after his sister was detained at an airport for a transaction that didn't match her profession. People didn't need a reason, just an impression, and impressions could come from skin tone, a name, an accent, or even how someone stood when tired. When Darren closed the inspection form and walked away like a man who had finished a task beyond reproach, Min stepped out from the side area. He didn't interrupt, didn't block anyone. He simply walked over to where Imani stood. The fresh pair of gloves in his hand weren't assigned to her case, but he placed them gently on the inspection table. A small gesture, silent, but his eyes lifted just as Imani looked toward him. Their eyes met. 1 second, then 2. He didn't speak, but in his look was something unmistakable. She wasn't alone in this moment. Not everyone looked the other way. Someone had witnessed this, and that someone was ready to let witnessing turn into action. Imani gave the slightest nod, seen only by Min. She placed her phone back in her bag and turned to examine her damaged suitcase. Sharp plastic edges scraped her hand, but she didn't flinch. All her senses were preparing for something much bigger. Min stepped back, slipping down a narrow corridor. His fingers brushed the face of his watch. One touch. The alert was silenced. A faint blink from the LED. The recording system had been running since Darren began. Min didn't speak, didn't seek acknowledgement. His job was to ensure this moment existed, and when the time was right, pass it to someone he knew would bring it to light. Some actions need no words, but once started, they force the entire system to speak. And this time, Min had no intention of deleting the file. Darren exited the screening zone at a slow pace, as if he had just handled another case that needed discipline. The smirk on his lips suggested satisfaction, while in his mind, her words replayed, "I will call my father," with amusement. He'd heard it all before. Celebrities, rich folks, everyone thought a name could exempt them. But after a few calls, they all backed down like every other traveler. For Darren, that threat was just another echo from people who thought they mattered more than they did. He walked into the staff room, tapped his radio to report. "Inspection completed. Checkpoint 3B. His voice was flat, mechanical. Then he slumped into a chair, hands clasped behind his head, eyes scanning the room until they met the mirror, reflecting a face full of smug satisfaction. To him, this was another victory, another reminder that the airport followed his rules. Meanwhile, outside in the terminal, Imani stood beside her distorted suitcase. She raised the phone to her ear. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was precise, each word delivered as if rehearsed. "Dad, I'm at JFK, a security officer just." She paused, glancing around at the people nearby. She lowered her voice, stepped back, and her gaze fell toward a nearby staff break room. A receptionist nearby looked up, surprise flashing across her face before vanishing. The young woman in a gray coat and crimson suit wasn't trembling or angry, but every move she made carried a silence that unsettled those around her. Ending the call, Imani slipped her phone into her bag. No explanations, no expressions. She stood still, adjusted her purse strap, eyes gliding over curious onlookers. Some noticed the light in her eyes wasn't defensive, it was restrained power, waiting to be unleashed. Darren returned minutes later, his smirk gone, replaced by a flat expression. He stood in front of her, arms crossed. "So, is he coming?" he asked, emphasizing "he" like a jab, hoping to hit a nerve. But Imani didn't respond like the others. She just looked at him, her hand resting on her strap, not defensively, but naturally. No surprise, no outrage, no panic. "You should stay in your place," she said, her voice softer than before but clear enough for Darren to tilt his head to make sure he'd heard right. "In a few minutes, something will say that to you better than I just did." Her words froze the air around them. Darren squinted, unsure how to respond, when an internal chime rang in the earpiece of a senior manager in Terminal C's control office. A flagged email had just arrived from Skywave Airlines. The subject line read, "Concerning a mishandled VIP passenger at Checkpoint 3B, and below that, a name no one in aviation dared to ignore, Jerome Carter. No need for extra formatting." The name alone created tremors, and those tremors had just begun to spread. A coordinator had just closed his laptop when the internal line rang. On the other end was the Skywave Airlines executive office. The voice wasn't loud, but each word was articulated with purpose, prompting the staffer to open his notebook and quickly jot down a note. "Priority access to Zone 3B. Name, Jerome Carter." There wasn't a single person in the airport system unfamiliar with that name. A senior assistant was immediately dispatched to the restricted door, tasked with escorting the man without any need for verification. The automatic doors slid open. There was no rush of footsteps, no entourage, no press cameras. Just one older man in a perfectly tailored black suit and a crisp white shirt was walking into the inspection zone with measured, steady steps. He didn't need to draw attention yet. The room seemed to pause the moment he entered. Imani stood near her damaged suitcase. She looked up as a familiar figure passed the employee seating area. Her gaze shifted, not teary, not shaken, only a subtle release, as if what she had been waiting for had arrived, and from here, she no longer needed to say a word. Jerome Carter scanned the room with the eye of someone intimately familiar with every tile, every checkpoint, every overlooked flaw in the system. He asked no questions, called no names. He walked straight to the inspection counter, where security staff were still chatting idly. Darren had just returned from a short break. He was mid-conversation with a colleague when he noticed a stranger stop directly in front of him. He was about to ask, "Can I help you?" when his eyes caught the clearance badge on the man's blazer, Skywave, Executive Clearance. Below it, the name, Jerome Carter. For a moment, Darren straightened instinctively. His face relaxed slightly, though his eyes stayed guarded. Jerome didn't introduce himself or request anything. He simply looked directly at Darren and asked in a steady, even tone, "Are you the one who handled my daughter's luggage this morning?" Darren swallowed hard. He realized administrative procedure couldn't save him now. Glancing quickly at the inspection table, he replied reflexively, "I followed protocol, nothing beyond my authority." Jerome didn't blink. His voice was smooth and unyielding. "I didn't ask about protocol. I asked how you define the word respect." Darren opened his mouth, but Jerome continued. His voice clipped. "It seems I need to reteach that today." Darren hesitated, sensing pressure more intense than any formal inquiry he had ever faced. The temperature in the inspection zone seemed to drop. Several staff had stopped moving, watching silently. No one interrupted, but no one resumed talking either. Jerome pulled his phone from his inner pocket, tapped in a short number, then held it to his ear. "I'm at Zone 3B3B. There's an issue with staff conduct. I'm requesting an immediate 72-hour suspension of Darren Kessler's operational access pending investigation. Skywave expects internal confirmation by this afternoon." Silence held on the other end. Jerome added, "I doubt you'd want me to bring up JFK's strategic funding history with Skywave." He ended the call, leaving a long, heavy pause. Darren stood frozen, his face shifting from rigid to pale. The surrounding staff whispered quietly. They didn't need to hear every word, just seeing how Jerome arrived, questioned, decided, and moved on, said more than enough about the system Darren had never imagined he'd collide with. But now he had. Darren glanced at his coworkers behind him as if searching for some silent validation, but no eyes met his. His voice came out rough, tinged with defiance and defense. "So I'm being disciplined because she's someone's daughter?" Jerome turned slightly, not moving his body but tilting his gaze. His reply cut through Darren's makeshift armor. "You're not suspended because she's my daughter. You're suspended because you forgot she's a human being." It was as if the air had been vacuumed out of the room. The hum of scanners and distant footsteps remained, but where they stood, everything halted. A young female staff member holding a clipboard lowered her head, fingers clenched along the edge to hide her discomfort. A male colleague glanced at Darren, then quickly looked away. No one defended him, no one contradicted, just silence. What remains when artificial authority is stripped away? Darren lowered his eyes to the radio at his hip, then to the badge clipped on his chest. A supervisor stepped forward and extended a hand. Darren hesitated, then slowly unclipped the badge. As it transferred into someone else's grasp, his shoulders slumped. A suspension form was placed on the desk. He said nothing. Any words now would only become self-incrimination. In a quiet corner, Mintron hadn't moved from his original spot. He hadn't intervened, hadn't left, but his eyes met Imani's once more. Neither smiled nor nodded. Yet their gaze spoke volumes. What was once dismissed as meaningless had finally returned to its rightful place. Something inside him loosened, as if the injustice he'd silently carried had found its voice and its messenger. Jerome glanced at his watch. He turned to the inspection supervisor, speaking in a soft, steady voice that could not be ignored. "I'll expect written confirmation by the end of today. Don't make me ask twice." The staffer nodded, speechless. Jerome didn't need to threaten or dominate. His presence's stride, his phrasing was enough to shed everything unnecessary. He turned and walked away from the security zone with slow, deliberate steps, never once looking back. Imani remained still. She watched her father go, not smiling, not speaking. Her face seemed cleansed of the invisible dust that had settled from the morning confrontation. In the hallway, murmurs began to rise. "Who was that? Do you know who that man is?" A staff member whispered. "Jerome Carter, Skywave Airlines." That name made a few people instinctively take a step back. The silence now lingering wasn't the tension of unease, but the quiet acknowledgement that what had just unfolded would not be swept aside. Darren sat down behind the inspection desk. In front of him lay the badge, now stripped from him, cold against the table's surface. There was no sneer, no smugness left on his face, only a sunken stillness he hadn't anticipated. For the first time that day, no expression could hide the hollow disquiet swelling inside him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he'd ever return to that position again. Casey Rudd slowly lifted her phone, carefully framing Imani in the shot. She had missed the start of the incident, but this part was enough. A black woman in a red suit saying the internet's favorite line, "I'll call my father." Casey smirked, stopped recording after 3 seconds, opened her editing app, and trimmed the silence from the beginning. The short clip was crafted perfectly to ignite the kind of bias she knew would spark millions of views. She posted the video to her personal account with a sarcastic caption, "A disruptive passenger demanding to call daddy to avoid screening. Privilege in a new outfit." The hashtag first-class drama added the final touch. Within hours, the clip surpassed 200,000 views. The comments flooded in like venom. Familiar phrases appeared with lightning speed, as if they were preset shortcuts of the internet's dark reflex. This is why security needs to be tougher. And here we go again, with the discrimination card. People like this give black women a bad name. She thinks the airport is her living room? No one asked what had happened before. No one sought more context. One image, one line, and a twisted narrative were enough to turn a person into a symbol of arrogance. Imani received her first notification when her phone buzzed for the 37th time that morning. She opened it to see her face, cropped from the video, enlarged under the headline, "JFK Airport Meltdown, VIP Passenger Causes Chaos." She didn't watch the whole thing. A single glance was enough to see how the story had been rewritten. Her fingers tapped to silence the alerts, returning the screen to stillness. But what had been posted didn't vanish, it multiplied. An email arrived from an organization that had once invited her as a guest speaker. The message was polite, but the question was direct. Should we adjust our program next month to reflect the current situation? A few people who had taken photos with her at past conferences checked in, but their tone leaned more toward concern than empathy. One was more blunt, texting, "If there's been a misunderstanding, it's best to clear it up quickly to minimize impact." A former colleague from an international scholarship program didn't message her directly, but posted a vague status. Sometimes, dignity comes not from knowing someone powerful, but from staying silent at the right time. Imani read that line several times. No anger, no sorrow, just a dry feeling in her throat, like swallowing a cup of salted water on a scorching day. She didn't need defense, but she was still surprised by how quickly people distanced themselves when reputation seemed contagious. That evening, under the soft yellow glow of her bedside lamp, her phone lit up once more. A message arrived from an anonymous account, its avatar a faint gray circle. The content was a single line, "They'll twist everything except the truth you hold." Below was a link to a secure file-sharing platform. The file inside was titled, "Footage, JFK, Terminal 3B, Internal, MP4. Imani didn't know who had sent it, but she knew she had just received the first piece to reclaim the story that had been stolen. She sat in her quiet room, the light from the phone screen casting a pale glow on her blank expression. Each time she scrolled, the list of comments grew longer. Sarcastic and judgmental remarks passed before her eyes. Trying to be the next famous victim? Guilty people always play innocent. Who does she even think she is? Some users had graduation photos as profile pictures, spoke with polished language, yet their words dripped with poison. The sneering tone spread wider than the truth ever could. A few former classmates from university also shared the clip. No captions, no messages, just the repost, letting the crowd draw their own conclusions. Faces she once worked with on community projects, who posed with her at scholarship anniversaries, were now silent. That silence didn't sting like attacks did, but it chilled in another way: selective retreat, quiet rejection. Her name began appearing in private online groups. A screenshot circulated with a new nickname, Miss First Class Drama. They juxtaposed her image at the security table with mocking memes and unverified rumors. Hundreds of comments danced below the images, half joking, half serious, all contributing to burying a real woman beneath a cardboard cutout built from malice. Her phone rang. It was her mother. The woman's voice was gentle, but a layer of worry clung to every word. "Is everything okay, dear?" Imani replied with only a few short lines. "It'll pass." She didn't want to pull her mother into the storm. Some things, even when shared, don't feel lighter, they just become someone else's burden too. She opened the clip again, watched the last few seconds where her voice had been sliced away from its full context. In her mind, everything was still vivid: the smell of shattered plastic, the sound of the photo frame cracking, Darren's icy stare as his foot crushed her belongings. But others didn't see that. They only saw a woman in a red suit, bold enough to say the line that conjures entitlement. The gap between truth and distortion clung to her like fine dust she couldn't brush off. She opened her writing app and typed the first line, then the second. The words didn't blame or rage, but stood alone in reflection. "I once believed dignity meant staying silent, but perhaps silence sometimes helps the wrong spread further." She paused, eyes fixed on the screen, finger hovering over the post button. Something held her back. A notification appeared. A new article had just been uploaded to a specialized aviation forum. She clicked. The headline stood out: "Incident at JFK. Internal camera captures irregularities in passenger screening." Her name wasn't mentioned, but the date, the screening area, and the description matched perfectly. The post came from an anonymous staff member within the airport's internal system. Someone had chosen not to stay silent anymore, and Imani knew the truth hadn't been buried, it was waiting for the right moment to rise. The next morning, Min Tran arrived at the check-in station as usual. His coffee was still warm, his uniform crisp, and his name tag caught the tired white light of the hallway. He glanced at the shift schedule on the screen, eyes sliding over familiar lines. He knew it so well he didn't need to search for his name, but this time he stopped. The line that should have listed him was no longer under Security Zone 3B. A brief pause. Then he turned toward the shift supervisor's desk. The older man didn't look up when Min asked. "You're assigned to the storage floor today," he said flatly, continuing to review the list as though reciting a weather update. No explanation, no report, no warning. Min stood still for a few seconds, then nodded. He wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time he had seen someone quietly removed for actions considered deviating from protocol. Back at the staff lockers, he found his assigned space had been locked. A bag sat on a bench nearby, holding his personal items: a lunch container, gloves, scattered documents, and a printed internal notice. The paper was sharply formatted, the italicized line as cold as the message it carried: Min Tran, left post without reassignment, temporarily relocated for performance review. An administrative excuse, just enough to pull him from his post and out of passenger visibility. He sat down and reread the note, as if looking for a typo in his name. But nothing was surprising. What was different this time was the stillness, not acceptance, but a deeper, quieter decision. Min opened his personal printer, silently cut a small rectangle of paper, typed in a brief message, and printed it. The white sheet was plain, the black text just big enough to read. No signature, no symbols, just one line. "This system is not blind, it chooses who gets to speak." He folded the note and slipped it into his shirt pocket. No one stopped him as he walked the hallway. No greetings, no nods. A few colleagues glanced over, their eyes quickly darting away as if even making contact with him would put them on the next reassignment list. A younger staffer just starting his shift hesitated, then turned away without a word. The passenger zone remained busy, the PA system announcing gate changes and boarding calls with indifferent regularity. Min walked slowly toward the side hallway, where he knew Imani often waited to collect her luggage. She was on the phone, gazing through the glass wall, hand gripping her bag strap. Min passed quietly behind her, pausing only to reach for her damaged suitcase. He gently placed the folded paper on the handle, text side up, the message like a small deliberate pause amid the noise. No one saw, no one heard, but that was his way of not disappearing without leaving a trace. He turned down a side corridor, where the fluorescent lights faded into a dimmer yellow, where the visible world gave way to forgotten spaces. He knew that even though he'd been pushed out, part of him remained not on a shift list, but in the palm of someone who understood that silence, however brief, could be a form of resistance. Imani's suitcase tilted slightly as she pulled it away. A strange texture brushed her fingers. She looked down and saw the small, perfectly square white note tucked into the handle. It had appeared at just the right moment. She glanced around. No one stood nearby. No one gave any sign. Calmly, she unfolded the paper and read the words, "This system is not blind, it chooses who gets to speak." Her eyes didn't blink, but her expression softened in a way only she could feel. It wasn't indifference, it was the opposite. She folded the paper neatly, like a secret passed hand to hand. As she slipped it into her wallet, images from the day before surfaced. The quiet nod, the gloves set down, the unflinching gaze moments belonging to someone she had never named, someone who was no longer there, and she knew that absence hadn't been his choice. Imani returned to the support desk, where Min had stood that morning beside the scanner. She asked a shift worker, a slim woman in her 40s with tired eyes. When she heard the question, her face tightened with uncertainty. "He was probably reassigned," she replied, voice trailing into a whisper. Imani looked into her eyes. There was no deceit, only the weariness of someone who had seen too much and changed too little. Others who overheard the name Min kept their distance, as if his name had become a virus, something that, once touched, marked you for deletion. Across the terminal, Min now held a stock scanner, checking barcodes on cargo containers. The lighting was duller here, the sounds of squeaky carts mingling with the scent of plastic wrap and chemical sanitizers. He stood upright, recording steadily, though his mind wandered to another space where a woman had nodded without words, where his hand had brushed the suitcase handle, and something unspoken had been exchanged. During his break, Min pulled his phone from his jacket, opening the recording app. The first file was labeled simply 3B, passenger check. He played a short segment. Imani's voice came through steady, composed, unmistakable. Behind it was Darren's clipped and condescending tone, like explaining rules to a disobedient child. Min paused the recording at the moment Darren said, "I'm the one who decides if you get to move forward." He renamed the file, the one who wasn't supposed to exist. Imani stood in the waiting area, phone in hand. For the first time, she didn't call her father. Her contact list scrolled, stopping at a number sent to her internally, for emergency coordination only. She made the call. Marcus Green speaking, came the firm male voice on the other end. "Do you know where Min Tran was relocated?" she asked directly. Marcus paused. Keystrokes clicked faintly in the background. "Hold on." Checking the system. A minute later, his tone changed. "I don't see Min Tran listed this week." She didn't answer, but he continued. "I checked the entire staff directory. There's no record of anyone named Min Tran ever assigned to Zone 3B. Imani closed her eyes. She didn't need to hear more. Min hadn't just been reassigned. Someone had erased Himaz, if anyone who dared to see clearly had no place here. But this was only the beginning. Darren Kessler's suspension file arrived on Marcus's desk at the start of his shift, tucked inside a thin plastic folder containing just 3 sheets of paper. The front page read, "Temporarily suspended per internal protocol, Zone 3B, incident dated 14th. The label was standard, but the speed of processing was unusual, almost immediate after the incident. Marcus frowned at the approving authority listed last, the Deputy Director of Security for Zones A through C, a figure who rarely signed off on anything unless under pressure or sensitive circumstances. Having served 10 years in the military, Marcus had a habit of scrutinizing every detail and never trusted things that moved too smoothly. On the second page, the witness section was blank, no sign that anyone aside from Darren had been involved in the verification. The report was tidy, rushed, and suspiciously convenient. He logged into the internal camera system, entered the 3B sector code, and set the time frame to match when Imani Carter had passed through the checkpoint. A wall of thumbnail footage popped up, time-stamped and tagged by location. Yet the key feed Darren's inspection station displayed an error. Footage file corrupted. Recovery in progress. Marcus leaned forward and checked the archive date. The data had been deleted 36 hours earlier than the system's minimum retention window. Leaning back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen, he tapped his his fingers on the desk. Someone had rushed to shut this down, and they knew exactly what to delete and when to do it. A technical move not overly complex, but requiring high-level access. The name Minh Tran surfaced in his memory, a faint branch in the airport's sprawling network. It wasn't on any official roster for the day, but Marcus distinctly remembered that face passing the briefing room during shift change. He pulled up the 3B schedule, scanning each line. Minh wasn't listed, possibly a backup or a temporary transfer, but that still didn't explain why Darren's file didn't mention him at all. Marcus got up and walked to the personnel office, requesting the last 3 weeks' shift assignments filtered by luggage screening support. Minh Tran appeared in 3 different slots, on 3 separate days, always in 3B, a repeated deployment pattern with clear intent. Back at his desk, Marcus opened his laptop and was about to jot down notes when a new email appeared. The sender used an internal anonymous address, subject line, "About Station 3B." The body contained only one sentence: "You should review the screening pattern at Station 3B over the past 3 months. I don't believe in the kind of randomness mentioned in the report." He reread it, then saved the email to a private folder. Numbers started to form in his mind: racial profiling statistics, detainment without cause, missing witness records. If the message was accurate, what happened to Imani Carter wasn't isolated. It was part of something wider, concealed behind the harmless label, everyone accepted without question. Random screening. The glow from Imani's phone reflected off her cheekbones, highlighting her wide, pensive eyes. She had just left a meeting with her attorney in Jerome, where most advice revolved around legal strategy and media impact. But Imani wasn't waiting for anyone to speak for her. She typed a short sentence on her social media app, without hashtags or emojis. "I'm not angry because I was detained. I'm angry because they called it normal." The post spread faster than expected. Within a day, her inbox filled with hundreds of messages, most from strangers, all disturbingly similar. They spoke of being stopped, searched, and interrogated in situations where the only visible reason seemed to be their skin tone, their names, or how they looked. Raina, a young woman from Atlanta, wrote that her retired nurse mother was held for 3 hours simply for carrying cash in her medicine pouch. Security suspected money laundering. She had to sit in the open lounge, visible to everyone, not allowed to make a call until someone from higher up confirmed she had flown business class before. A finance student named Omar, enrolled at a public university in the East, shared that he was held in Denver for having too many passport stamps. Even though his trip was domestic, he was interrogated about his international travel history and why he was in the U.S., despite being born in Philadelphia. A couple of African descent sent a photo with their account. TSA officers once tore apart their luggage at O'Hare. "My underwear ended up on the terminal floor," the wife wrote. "I bent down to pick them up under dozens of staring eyes." My husband was questioned for owning a Rolex watch. Imani read each line, noting repeated phrases: record mismatch, deep screening, unusual behavior, ambiguous conduct. She didn't need years of experience to recognize those terms as veils for institutional bias. A new message flashed on her screen with an unusual title: "I work at JFK and have witnessed similar situations. I possess internal statistics. If you want them, reply with the code silent alert." Imani paused. She reread it carefully. No spelling errors, no misplaced capitals, no excessive punctuation. It had the tone of someone who'd waited a long time for this chance. She typed the words slowly: silent alert. There was no immediate response, but she didn't put her phone down. She checked the time, straightened her posture, and prepared to leave the room. Just then, the screen lit up with an incoming call. Marcus Green. "We need to meet in person," he said directly. "And, you might want to see some numbers I just found." She didn't ask questions. Her eyes had changed, no longer carrying silent endurance but sharp resolve. What happened at the airport no longer belonged solely to her. It was spreading like ink on paper, and every message she read was a signature from voices waiting to expose a truth long buried. The Internal Affairs office on the 3rd floor was never a loud place. Marcus Green sat alone in front of the screen, the glow from the internal system interface reflecting off his glasses. He had been tasked with reviewing the procedures of the Zone 3B inspection team following the incident involving Imani Carter. It was supposed to be a formality, a way to close the file quietly, as they often said. But Marcus had no intention of doing that. He typed Darren Kessler into the search bar and added a filter for the past 18 months. The system displayed work logs, shift reports, and technical notes, the standard items. But the passenger feedback section revealed 3 unusual entries, all marked internally resolved, without any attached conclusion memo. A click opened brief descriptions. The first case involved a black female passenger detained for over 4 hours due to a supposed mismatch between her credit card and the name on her ticket. The initial note stated suspicious transaction, but the verification section confirmed valid card, matching details. Passenger was apologized to and released. The second case concerned a Middle Eastern student from New Jersey who was ordered to remove his shoes and belt in a public area for slow response to inspection order. There was no recorded defiance, yet the report justified it as a sensitive situation. The third case involved an Indian national working in telecommunications who was forced to open his laptop at the reception desk due to unclear security files. Upon review, the file turned out to be a simple PDF staff chart. 3 cases, 3 different ethnicities, yet all shared a silent thread of discrimination, and all 3 had been overseen by the same person, Evelyn Monroe. Marcus leaned back, eyes narrowing. What struck him wasn't just the content, but how these records were lumped into resolved without any formal resolution. Instead of the digital signature from the Ethics Compliance Unit, each case ended with a faint note, reviewed fully, no further action required. Marcus had worked in the system long enough to know that wording didn't come from the report authors, it came from those who made sure the authors stayed silent. He printed all 3 cases, numbered them in the upper corner, and clipped them into a fresh folder labeled plainly, Kessler, Conduct Review. But inside, the picture had shifted. Darren was no longer an isolated incidente, was a link in a pattern of cases quietly buried. Marcus stared at one familiar name, Evelyn Monroe, a senior supervisor who had never drawn much attention, always stationed at the intersection of quiet resolution and let it be. He opened the internal email system, typed in Evelyn's address, and wrote a simple message. I need the original records of the internally labeled cases tied to Darren Kessler. Please respond today. Within 15 minutes, Marcus received a message from an anonymous sender. No subject, no greeting, just one line. Don't dig too deep unless you're authorized. There are things you don't want to touch. He froze, not out of fear, but because the wording mirrored the rhythm of a system long accustomed to issuing warnings from the shadows. This time, Marcus wasn't backing down. The internal surveillance room was nearly soundproof. As Marcus stepped in, the door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing in the weight of the air. Evelyn Monroe sat at her desk, fingers around a steaming cup of tea. Her gaze locked onto him the moment he entered, not as a welcome, but as someone seasoned in facing confrontation and surviving it. Marcus didn't sit right away. He pulled the folder from his bag, laid the 3 printed reports in front of her without preamble. Numbers, brief but precise details, laid across white paper. Each page bore Darren Kessler's name boldly marked in the top corner. Evelyn glanced over them without expression. But when Marcus spoke, the air between them tightened. 3 times in under a year. Why is there no conclusive report? His tone was measured, not aggressive, but every word cut straight into the defensive wall she had clearly spent years maintaining. Evelyn was silent, not out of denial or protest, but in a short pause that signaled deliberate response. After a few seconds, she looked away from the pages and toward the window on her left, where only the blurred movement of people in the hallway could be seen. They didn't want me to record anything further, she said. Her voice was neither harsh nor tired. It felt like a line that had waited too long to be spoken. The answers were already written before I even saw the reports. Marcus sat down gently, but his posture betrayed disappointment. "Who are they?" he asked calmly. Evelyn didn't turn back. Her hand still rested on the teacup, her index finger tracing a slow arc along the handle. "You know, I don't have to say it. This structure was built so no one would need to name names." Marcus fell quiet. He didn't need to press. The silence had spoken. He gathered the reports and nudged them slightly closer to her. "Then at least tell me," he said, "who issued the directive to fast-track cases marked insufficient evidence of bias? Was it from the administrative division or the interagency coordination network?" Evelyn finally turned to face him. Her eyes wavered, something Marcus had never seen in her before. That label, insufficient evidence, is how they preserve the force's image, maintain partnerships, and shield the command from press inquiries. Outside, printers hummed, footsteps echoed, and pagers rang. But inside, every sentence landed like a fresh mark on the air. Marcus took no notes, said nothing more. He closed the file, stood up. "Silence is a choice, but if you don't speak up this time, the system will continue sliding, and we may not be able to pull it back." "Oh," Evelyn didn't nod, didn't reply, but her fingers tightened slightly around the teacup handle. It was the only signal Marcus needed. He left. The door clicked shut behind him, with the same soft sound. But something inside had changed. That evening, an anonymous email appeared in Marcus's inbox. Attached was a PDF labeled "Original Memo, Case 3. Inside was the report bearing Evelyn Monroe's full signature, but beneath it, a faded watermark revealed an edit, added later. The original line read, "Indications of racial bias require further investigation." It had been crossed out and replaced with, "No grounds for continued inquiry." Someone had intervened, and that signature was now proof of a deeper, systematic falsification. Marcus stared at the screen, his hand hovering over the save button. The game had just shifted to a new phase. Marcus Green sat before the administrator's screen, the cold light of data files casting pale reflections across his face, now tilted slightly with unease. His assigned task was to review all security screenings at Terminal 3B over the past 3 months, essentially a backstage cleanup to prepare a safe, sanitized response for the media. But Marcus had never been one to do things just to tick a box, especially not after that look Imani gave him. It wasn't an accusation, it was a reminder. Someone was watching from the other side of the system. He began filtering the list of passengers flagged for additional screening. The further he scrolled, the deeper the creases on his forehead grew. The frequency of checks disproportionately targeted passengers of African, Middle Eastern, South Asian descent, or those with uncommon names in English. Each name he marked had matching files, business class tickets, valid documentation, and timely check-ins. Nothing suggested they should have been held except for one thing: they didn't fit the unspoken image of what someone deemed low risk. One name appeared twice in the same week. Samir Qureshi, a Pakistani economist flying from Boston to JFK for a conference. Both times, he was detained due to suspicious luggage patterns, yet the inspections found nothing. Another entry showed a black student flying business class, flagged twice within 5 days. Marcus marked them all, and the unease took on a name and face. He called over a routing supervisorone who usually sat quietly at the secondary checkpoint to ask questions. The man glanced at the screen, then spoke in a low, cautious tone. "The system uses machine learning for risk filtering. We don't control the algorithm. It generates lists based on history." Marcus locked eyes with him, but the man shifted his gaze away, adding one last line before retreating. "We just follow protocol. Most of it's automated." "Not that automated." Marcus traced a string of technician access notes to a hidden panel outside the main menu. At the top was a file named Preferred Screening List. Its description read, "Risk weighting based on identity profile, travel history, declarations, and supplementary factors." The terminology sounded academic, but beneath it lay something far harsher: a blacklist camouflaged in code. He cross-referenced that list with the Terminal 3B records from the week of Imani's incident. Her name appeared third. Next to it, a flag: Enhanced Verification, Inconsistent Profile. He opened her file. First-class ticket, clean record, no alerts from the airline. Everything was in order, yet she'd been flagged, maybe for her skin, maybe for her name, maybe both. He began exporting the data. As he hit the print command, the screen flickered. A message popped up. Session terminated. System under maintenance. He tried to log back in, but his access was suspended. Error codes flashed without pattern, as though someone had drawn a line in the sand. Marcus leaned back, exhaled slowly. His reflection hovered on the dark screen. That feeling of being watched wasn't paranoia. What he had uncovered wasn't a glitch, it was deliberate, and he had just stepped into the middle of it. Leaving the office earlier than usual, he carried an encrypted drive hidden in his coat. He no longer trusted the internal network after being shut out. What he touched wasn't a technical oversight. Every sign pointed to an invisible layer built to shield something much larger, and someone above didn't want him digging deeper. He arrived at a small cafe in Old Brooklyn, where the Wi-Fi was weak but safe. Anya Patel sat at a far corner, a thin laptop before her, holding a cup of mint tea. She had once been a lead architect of the Skywave passenger filter system until she abruptly resigned 2 years ago, citing misaligned values. Marcus had heard rumors she allegedly refused to adjust algorithms based on verbal orders from closed-door meetings. Anya opened the file he brought, her eyes moving swiftly through lines of code. A faint smirk surfaced as she recognized a familiar structure. They're still using the risk image filter. It's not officially permitted, but it's always been there, she said without looking up. Marcus leaned forward. What do you mean? The image risk score is a proxy variable. It gauges inconsistencies between declared identity and face recognition, voice tone, and even gait. She typed in a few more retrieval commands. Initially, the system only offered suggestions. Then came manual interventions. They added priority groups, no documentation, no public listing. A new script file opened. Inside, one line read, "Not applicable to business class passengers unless flagged as P7. Marcus's eyes paused at the descriptor. What is P7? Anya responded evenly. Passengers deemed inconsistent between appearance and financial profile. In simpler terms, they don't look like someone who can afford first class. This group is subjected to enhanced checks, even without any violations. She scrolled down and searched a specific string. The result came up. Imani Carter flagged as P7 at booking. For exceptional profile, additional verification, no security concerns listed. Marcus went silent. He didn't know what was worse, the existence of such a list, or how seamlessly it functioned, while everyone believed the system was simply automatic. He asked Anya to back up the logs, duplicate the structure of the list, and take internal notes. As the final file was transferred to his drive, a new email popped up, this one from the regional director, who had never contacted him directly. The subject line avoided overt threats, but the content was unmistakable. You are accessing data beyond your authorization. If you proceed, it will be treated as an unlawful intrusion. Anya looked at Marcus, her eyes calm but alert. So now they've seen you. Now you know this isn't a bug. Marcus nodded. The acknowledgement didn't need words. What he had stumbled upon wasn't an error. It was a system, deliberate, refined, and hidden behind polished language. And once it started noticing you, it meant you were closer to the truth than ever before. The phone screen lit up strangely in the middle of the night. Imani squinted at it, her eyes adjusting to a string of disconnected characters appearing under sender, no name, no clear address, just a jumble of meaningless letters and numbers. The subject line was blank. She opened the message, a chill crawling down her spine despite the room's lack of air conditioning. The content was brief, shorter than a text message. You're lucky to have someone to call. Many others were held for 6 hours with no explanation. Worse, if they didn't speak English. Some names were flagged before they even stepped past the scanner. There was no signature, no farewell, just one final italicized line, faded slightly compared to the rest. Don't assume the system is random. It chooses people, not circumstances. She read it again, and again, and again. Each sentence pressed like a rivet into fragments of memory that had yet to settle. Darren's scrutinizing stare, the silence of nearby staff, and the apologies never spoken by witnesses who said nothing. It felt as if this email wasn't sent to her, but rather confirmed everything she had once doubted. Imani typed keywords into a search bar. TSA bias, airport profiling, random screening discrimination. Dozens of articles surfaced, some from years ago, others just months old. Some had been marked unavailable, dead links embedded in half-finished reports. There were exposés revealing systems that sorted passengers by name and ethnicity. Research showed that travelers with African surnames were 4 times more likely to be detained than those with European names. She reopened her messages, finding those who had offered support after the edited clip went viral. Many had done more than comfort her. They shared their own stories. A brown-skinned man had his luggage torn apart for paying cash on a business-class ticket. A South Asian woman was interrogated for carrying an Arabic book, even though it was a bilingual Quran. A mother was detained with her 8-year-old son because her suitcase looked too clean for an immigrant. Imani leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Incidents she once saw as isolated now lined up like a system. Her name, her skin, her language, even her clothing, all may have been scanned, sorted, and tagged long before she reached the security gate. She had never considered that her father's status was the only reason she hadn't been detained longer, not until others began saying they had no one to call, no one influential enough to make someone pause. She reopened the email, typed a short reply, "Who's choosing?" and hit send. There was no confirmation, no chime. Minutes later, the sender's address vanished. The window went blank. The account was gone. The link broke. She stared into the empty inbox, where a voice once echoed strange yet disturbingly familiar. And in that silence, she understood. Someone was watching the system from inside. This time, they had chosen to speak. The cafe sat tucked behind an old row of buildings, quiet and rarely crowded. Imani arrived early, took a seat by the window, and reviewed the list of green-marked messages in her inbox. The first woman she had arranged to meet was a nurse, a single mother who had written a simple note. "I know how you feel. My daughter waited 6 hours because my suitcase didn't match my income." The door opened. A woman walked in, slight in frame, with a face that wouldn't be remembered by most. But when she sat down and began speaking, her voice carried the weight of invisible hours spent fading into the background of a cold airport. "I'm not angry I was held," she said after a sip of cold tea. "I'm angry no one saw us. No one questioned why an 8-year-old had to lean against a wall, lips purple, without water. No one asked why I didn't get a chance to explain my luggage." Imani wrote everything down: location, time, staff names if remembered. Patterns emerged more clearly with each interview. She called over 20 others who had messaged her, assembling testimonies into a growing table of recurring entries. Black individuals, South Asians, Middle Easterners, and those with limited English all dominated the repeat screening list. Some were inspected 3 times in 2 months. Some were forced to unpack everything because their behavior didn't align with professional records. She dialed Marcus Green. His voice was deeper than usual. When she asked him to review camera logs from the day she was stopped, he hesitated. "I filed the request, but the center's response says the data is unavailable. It wasn't deleted, but it's inaccessible." Silence followed. He added, "Some things get erased before I ever see them." Imani understood. Some moments don't disappear, they're just locked away, sealed in parts of the system no one is allowed to touch, and unless someone forces them open, they remain asleep forever. She returned home, opened her laptop, and set it on the familiar desk. A new folder appeared. The title, a quiet cut across the screen. The Unseen Ones. She opened each file, tagged each story, carefully attaching dates and checking verifiable facts. The night wind stirred the curtain. Imani didn't look outside. She was replaying the recording of the single mother, the voice still crisp through the phone. "I'm not asking for power. I just want someone to notice when I'm pushed aside like I don't exist." She added another description: no embellishments, no appeals. Just one certainty remained. Truth doesn't speak for itself. Someone has to press record, reopen the file, and name every person the system once tried to reduce to a shadow in its endless corridor. The room on the 18th floor of Skywave headquarters was unusually quiet. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Kennedy Airport, where planes took off and landed with the rhythm of a system Jerome Carter once thought he fully understood. Imani stepped in, her voice firm though not raised. "If you have that much power, why haven't you changed the screening process from the start?" Jerome didn't answer right away. He looked up from the screen, removed his glasses, and folded his arms as if trying to slow time. Airport coordination isn't as simple as you think. There are layers of oversight, multiple stakeholders, both governmental and private. Everything requires balance. His tone was calm, polite, cloaked in the language of someone long accustomed to closed-door meetings. Imani remained standing, clutching a printed folder. I've read the reports. I know about the P7 system, the identity-based sorting algorithm, and I know someone once proposed scrapping it. Her gaze held steady. Jerome looked away, adjusting his collar as though evading the pressure in her eyes. 3 years ago, I pushed for reform, he said, voice lowering. We proposed anonymizing passenger profiles before they entered preliminary screening. No names, no race, no addresses, no professions. Just randomized IDs, so no one would unconsciously judge a foreign name or an unfamiliar face. Imani nodded slightly. And what happened to that proposal? Jerome gave a faint laugh. They shut it down in 8 minutes. Not for cost or technical concerns. The reason? Without early categorization, they'd lose proactive control. They called it a strategic image protection protocol. Imani sat down, her tone lowered, edged with cold disappointment. Image protection, or the image of power preserved by choosing who to delay so others feel safe? Jerome said nothing. He looked out at the lines forming at the security area. They didn't want to lose the right to choose. They wanted to retain the ability to detain someone without explanation. Because when someone gets pulled aside, everyone else believes the system is working. Imani fell silent. Sometimes, disappointment comes not from what you see, but from what you never expected to see in someone you once trusted beyond logic. She didn't need an apology. What she had just heard wasn't a confession of betrayal, but the testimony of someone who had seen the cracks but lacked the resolve to break and rebuild. I'm not angry, she said, eyes fixed on him. I'm just sad. If you'd done things differently then, maybe I wouldn't have had to stand in the middle of an airport defending my dignity alone. Jerome looked at her, his gaze aging with the weight of her words. There is no silence a father can bear when his child suffers for choices he didn't make. But he also knew, by now, no justification could shrink the distance between them. Jerome pushed open the side door to a meeting room. The lighting was softer. The space was built more for quiet exchanges than transparency. He laid a thick folder on the table and turned the pages slowly, though every word was etched in his memory. Imani sat across from him, watching as internal memos, meeting notes, and executive correspondence passed through his hands. Each page bore the familiar tone of decision-makers who preferred to leave no trace. He paused at a bold sentence near the bottom. Eliminating random control compromises, deterrent capability. Proposal rejected. He didn't look at his daughter, as if facing her would amplify the shame. I stayed quiet, he said softly. I believed in internal change. I thought I'd get another chance. And I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, you'd bear the consequences. Imani nodded, not surprised, though not easily forgiving. I was still detained, still treated like I didn't belong, even when you did nothing. So, who did your silence protect? The question hovered in the air. They sat close, yet separated by a 3-year stretch neither dared revisit. Jerome straightened, fingers laced together. Sometimes power makes you think you have time, he said slowly. More meetings, more terms, more chances. But when I saw you treated like a stranger, at the place named Skywave, I realized I was wrong. Not wrong in action, but in hesitation. Imani slid a page from the folder and placed it on the table. The print was small but clear. Deployment denied. Strategic Risk Authority should not be decentralized. She read it again, and then let it go, as if it confirmed what she had long suspected but never proved, that discrimination wasn't random, but intentional, directed, and systemic. I don't study politics, she said, eyes still on the document. But I know whoever wrote this didn't need speeches. They manipulate by staying silent in the right places and speaking sparingly in places that attract attention. Jerome remained quiet, then stood, walking to the window overlooking the concourse. You have every right to be angry, to believe I failed. He turned, meeting her eyes. But if you plan to do something bigger this time, I won't hold you back. I'll stand with you, not as a father, but as someone who once chose retreat and now carries that weight. Evelyn Monroe looked up as Marcus entered. He didn't knock, didn't greet her. He placed the file on the desk, his voice calm and cold. Random checks over 80% fall on people of color. Do you call that a coincidence? Evelyn opened the file, skimmed a few lines, then let it rest, her eyes never leaving Marcus. Data doesn't tell the whole story. We're trained to identify abnormal behavior, not to discriminate. Marcus leaned a hand on the chair across from her, gaze sharp like a thin blade. Then how do you explain this recording? He played the audio. The voice was quiet but unmistakable. No need to check those who visually match the assets they possess. Evelyn flinched slightly. It was a supervisor's voice during an internal meeting. The statement wasn't in any document, yet it echoed louder than any policy. She didn't deny it. She leaned back slightly, fingers interlaced. What do you intend to do with it? Marcus didn't respond immediately. He watched her, like someone familiar with confronting intentional silence. Has anyone ever told you to prioritize those who don't match the financial profile? Evelyn pressed her lips together. We're not given orders like that, but her voice trailed off. Marcus leaned in. But what? She glanced toward the window, then back at him. They don't write it down. It comes through training sessions, slideshow language, and comments tossed between meetings. They don't say black or Asian. They say conflicting behavior or financial appearance inconsistency, and let us fill in the blanks. Marcus nodded slightly, his tone lowering. And how did you fill it in? Evelyn didn't reply, not because she didn't know, but because she knew too well. Silence stretched. Under the sterile white light of the office, no one moved. At last, she spoke softly. Do you know Michael Reston? Marcus frowned. The name was familiar. My predecessor. 3 years ago, he proposed changing how we evaluate passengers. He wanted to eliminate identity-based risk models. He submitted a formal report suggesting a truly random screening system. Marcus stayed quiet. Evelyn continued, slower now. 3 weeks later, he was demoted for violating command protocol. 6 months after that, he left the agency. No one mentioned his name again. Marcus let out a breath, barely audible. Evelyn looked directly at him for the first time since the conversation began. I'm not defending myself. I want you to understand. Some things don't need to be written into law to erase someone who dares to go against it. Marcus didn't look away. Is that why you stayed silent? Evelyn answered without hesitation. That's why many of us are still here. In that moment, both knew. Darren Kessler was only the surface. People like Evelyn were the parts of the system that chose survival, even if it meant silence before wrong. Marcus stood and took the file. He didn't slam the table, didn't raise his voice, and didn't promise anything. But his eyes, as he walked out, said enough. The truth had crossed the border of unnamed directives. The door had barely closed when Evelyn's expression changed. Her voice sank, no longer administrative. Yes, she said, nearly whispering. But you'll never find those words written down. They don't exist in any manual. They exist in the way they curate images, title slides, or label passengers as behaviorally incompatible. Marcus remained seated, eyes fixed on her. Evelyn stepped back toward the filing cabinet, as if needing something to hold on to. I used to think that if no one said it outright, then no one was forcing anything. But during my first holiday season in this role, I was invited to an internal security briefing. I remember the slides. They showed images of passengers flagged for fraud risk. All had something in common. Marcus nodded slightly. Appearance. Evelyn closed her eyes. And background. Some were marked because they dressed modestly but used priority cards. Some were pulled aside, just for having an unfamiliar name. Once, I saw a photo of a black woman in a red suit circled with the note, behavior likely incompatible with income. She looked exactly like Imani. Marcus leaned back, hand resting on the folder, not taking notes, just listening, memorizing. Then why did you stay? Evelyn paused. I used to push back, she whispered. I asked my direct supervisor how they concluded who was suspicious. He laughed, said, "You're new. You don't get it yet. We're not arresting them. Just checking." Her voice slowed, as though dragging weight from deep within. I thought I could change things from the inside. But once, I almost submitted a report suggesting a revision to behavioral assessment criteria. Before I sent it, I met with Michael Reston. He told me not to, Marcus frowned. Why? Evelyn held his gaze for a long time. Because he already had, and it cost him everything. She told how Michael had once been a respected figure in passenger risk analysis. When he proposed reforms, he was branded as someone who couldn't handle field pressure. After his demotion, he left the field. His wife, who had a chronic illness, lost insurance after he lost his job. She died a few months later. There was no farewell, no formal resignation, no mention of him in any subsequent meeting. Evelyn looked at Marcus, her eyes dry but tired. I'm not proud, but I'm not sure I could bear what he went through. Sometimes I look in the mirror and don't know what I'm still holding on to. Marcus said nothing. He understood this wasn't an excuse. It was a quiet, persistent fear that doesn't scream but corrodes from within. Evelyn sat down, hands resting on the table. If you ask me if this system is wrong, I'll nod. But if you ask whether I ever had the courage to tear it down, I never did. Marcus stood. I don't need you to tear it down, he said, voice steady and firm. I just need you to take one step outside of it. The rest, someone else will do. Evelyn gave a faint nod. As Marcus left the room, she remained seated, hands still clasped. Outside, passengers stood in line at the screening zone. The system kept running smoothly, as if no questions had ever been raised. But for the first time, inside it, a single link had begun to tremble. The meeting room on the 17th floor was designed to be soundproof. Through the transparent glass, the runway stretched into the distance as flights took off one after another. Imani sat across from her father, with a slim folder perfectly aligned on the wooden table between them. On the envelope, a typed line read, "Internal adjustment document, not for public release." Jerome leaned slightly to one side, his left hand resting loosely on his knee. He didn't look at his daughter for long, as if doing so only added to his weariness. A discreet assistant poured water and exited silently. No one spoke for the first few minutes. "You're being asked to confirm that the airport incident caused no significant harm," Jerome said in a flat tone, without pressure. "Skywave's legal team drafted this as gently as possible to protect both you and the company." Imani reached out and flipped the first page. She read line by line, her eyes methodical, as if scanning a document thoroughly, yet her mind wandered to the messages she had received the week before. A woman sent a photo of her suitcase, ransacked simply because her husband's name sounded suspicious. A student said he missed his college entrance exam after being held for 6 hours, with no apology. Each story was a shadow. They didn't dissolve in light, but clung to the hands and minds of those who read them. Jerome slid an older file across to her. "Did you know I once refused to cooperate with a government agency because they asked the airline to report passengers whose appearance didn't match financial records? That year, Skywave nearly lost its rights to the European route." Imani flipped through the pages, noticing the date was close to when her mother passed away. She said nothing at first, then lowered her voice. "What if you had resisted all the way?" Jerome looked up and met her gaze directly. "Then we probably wouldn't be sitting in this room. Skywave might not exist, and you might have gone to public school, taken out student loans, worked evening shifts." Imani nodded lightly, not out of agreement, but as if accepting a reality. The cost was real. But was it worth it? The draft before her was phrased politely, acknowledges that the situation does not constitute a breach of conduct, recognizes that the security response remained within procedural bounds, not a single word of apology. Every phrase is lawyered down to avoid causing harm to any party, except the truth. Imani picked up the envelope and stood. She didn't say whether she would sign. Jerome didn't ask. They understood each other too well to need confirmation. As she reached the door, she paused, turned her phone in her hand, and sent a message to Marcus Green. "I choose the path with no envelope. Be ready." She slid the phone into her coat pocket, still holding the folder as if it were part of her outfit, neither burdensome nor relevant. Behind her, Jerome remained seated, eyes fixed on the fading white streaks, trailing the horizon. The air had never been tense, yet so heavy that neither of them wanted to return. On Imani's face, there was no smile, no anger, just a slow-burning resolve. Like ink drying on a final draft she refused to sign. The apartment lights reflected off the window glass, beyond which the city ran tirelessly. Imani leaned back in her chair, laptop on her lap, watching each frame of a short video featuring Casey Rudd. She had avoided replaying it for days, as if facing an edited version of herself was a wound still raw. But this time, her eyes were different. No reaction, just sharp observation, detached from personal emotion. Below the video, thousands of comments flooded in. Some posed thoughtful questions, others were cruel and blunt. But amid the noise, private messages began to surface one by one. A mother recounted being detained at the airport because of her headscarf, her daughter crying nearby with no explanation. A student said he lost a scholarship after being late to an interview following 6 hours of interrogation. A middle-aged brown woman shared that she'd flown business class for 7 years, but had never once passed security without being stopped. Imani sat still, fingers skimming through each line, mind storing the scattered details. The stories felt small on their own, piled together like stones paving the path of an invisible machine that had long been operating. She started a simple spreadsheet, recording names, contact info, times, locations, and the nature of each incident, not to compile statistics, but to ensure no one was forgotten. When she began typing the subject line of a new email, she paused for a few seconds. It read, "A question for the system." The message contained only 2 lines. "Who defines appearance suitable for wealth? I will speak." She hit send, directing it to the list of press outlets she had saved. An hour later, Jerome's secretary sent a message. Skywave's legal department advised Mr. Carter to publicly separate the company's position from Miss Carter's personal statements. Imani read it, then replied succinctly, "That's his choice. I've made mine." Her phone vibrated. Marcus called, his voice even, emotionless. He confirmed receipt of her email and the witness list she had compiled. "I'll forward it to the interagency task force," he said. "If you're willing to appear as the lead witness, I'll need written confirmation." Imani didn't respond right away. She walked to the window, looking down at the streams of yellow headlights flowing through the streets below. The night wasn't cold, but her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from knowing exactly what line she was about to cross. She returned to the table, pulled out a notebook her mother once gave her, and turned to the final page. The black ink began to glide steadily, without erasures. "Silence is a privilege for those who don't need to prove they belong. I never had that privilege, but I do have one choice, to speak, so those who have no one beside them will know they are not alone." She closed the notebook, looked at a small family photo on the shelf. In it, Jerome smiled, while 12-year-old Imani stood beside him, clutching the collar of his shirt. Between that photo and the present was a long stretch of invisible lines she once bowed her head to cross. Not anymore. She had stepped forward and chosen to remain in the light. The top-floor conference room was lined with thick light gray carpeting, its double-glass doors sealing off the runway noise below. Warm yellow lights spread across the long oval table where 8 men and 2 women sat facing Jerome Carter. A short distance separated them, but the tension felt like an invisible barrier. Sanford Lee, chairman of the executive board, placed both hands on the table, his voice low but deliberate. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Mr. Carter. We'd like to discuss possible media responses before the situation spins out of control." Jerome didn't respond. His eyes skimmed the slim folder just handed out. Each page was filled with media reports and public sentiment statistics regarding the JFK airport incident. A red-inked headline stood out. "Brand Association, Mid-Term Risk." A member seated to Lee's right emphasized, "Right now, the name Skywave appears alongside the keyword Imani Carter on more than 20 major news platforms." The situation had already cooled down, but she just went public with a list of witnesses. "Are you certain she's acting on her own?" someone to the left asked, the tone no longer courteous. "The press is beginning to question the father-daughter link in this matter." Jerome looked at the man who had spoken, his face unreadable. "I can't control other people's thoughts, not even my daughter's." A woman at the end of the table, more neutral in her tone, added, "We understand family dynamics are complex, but as a major shareholder of Skywave, your voice can shape the company's direction in this phase." Lee gave a slight nod, his eyes fixed on Jerome. "A neutral statement from you could help calm things down. If you clarify that Imani's actions are personal and don't reflect Skywave's position, we'll have reason to separate the two narratives." Jerome interlocked his fingers and turned his gaze directly toward the man at the head of the table. "What troubles you isn't my daughter's story. It's what her story forces people to confront. No one spoke, but discomfort was evident. One adjusted his glasses, and another rubbed his chin, waiting for Jerome to continue. He leaned forward, his voice steady but colder. I sat in rooms like this when Skywave was first founded. Back then, I kept quiet to secure contracts, protect my shares, and stabilize our flight network. Now, you ask me to do it again, this time as a father? Lee's tone remained calm. We're only protecting the joint venture's stability. A neutral statement would help guide the narrative, preserve equity, and prevent legal entanglements. Jerome stood, remaining silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it resonated through the sealed room. If I must choose between being a shareholder or staying silent in the face of truth, I choose to lose my shares. No one replied. Some looked down at the table. Others flipped through documents to avoid his gaze. The meeting dragged on a few more minutes, but there were no questions left worth answering. When Jerome walked out, his footsteps were slow but firm, as if he had just shed a weight someone had once forced him to carry. The air inside the room remained thick, despite the steady hum of the air conditioner. Lee squinted as an assistant placed a new strategy report in front of him. The red graph dipped sharply without warning. Skywave stock has fluctuated 3% over the past 48 hours, he said, flipping the page. International media are tagging Amanda Carter directly to the airline's name. We've lost control of the story. A thin man with sunken cheeks nodded in agreement. The public now demands a response from Skywave. She's become the face of something much bigger than herself. From a business standpoint, she's no longer a victim, she's a variable. Jerome rested his arms on the chair's edge, leaning slightly. If the system had protected passengers like my daughter, she wouldn't be a variable, she'd be a consequence. A soft scoff came from the end of the table. An older member, face flushed, chuckled bitterly. She's not an activist, she's your daughter. So tell us, are you here as a father or a shareholder? The question landed like the final move in a power game. Everyone waited for a response. Jerome stared at the man, unflinching. I've been a husband, a son, a fundraiser, a man who bit his tongue to keep this airline afloat. Now, I choose to be Imani's father. The answer needed no further explanation. It cut through the council's layers of rationale, hitting something they never expected to face in that room: loyalty that couldn't be bought with dividends. A young woman on the board flipped through her files, feigning distraction, but her eyes stole a glance at Jerome, searching for proof that someone could still refuse to compromise. Lee folded his arms and leaned back in his chair. So you refuse to issue a statement? His voice was even, though fatigue crept in. I won't issue anything, Jerome replied. I'll live by what I know to be right. Nothing more was said. The meeting ended, without a formal close. Board members left in quiet groups, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, but unable to erase the heaviness left behind. Jerome gathered his papers and walked toward the door. Just as his hand touched the knob, a folded piece of paper appeared in front of him. A young member, clearly one of the least vocal in the room, had quietly placed it on the table where Jerome had been sitting. He opened it in the hallway. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, but resolute. They can't block every path. I'll reach out. In the long, empty corridor, he paused for a moment. The note was folded carefully and tucked into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Outside, strips of sunlight fell unevenly across the cold stone floor, as if to remind him there were still cracks of light, just wide enough for one person to pass through. But sometimes, that's all it takes to spark a larger shift. An anonymous account named Air Witness surfaced on a public safety forum, uploading a 6-minute video without any intro, watermark, or narration. The footage opened with a shaky but steady long shot of JFK Airport's corridor, clearly capturing Imani standing in front of Officer Darren Kessler. The angle remained unchanged throughout, with no cuts. Imani stood tall, holding her boarding pass, eyes fixed ahead. Darren questioned her repeatedly, his voice louder than necessary. Her expression never shifted, her gaze cold and composed. She didn't make any inappropriate gestures, responding with calm, precise statements. Another officer passed by, glanced at them briefly, then moved on. The video felt like suspended time, tension mounting in the silence. Within an hour, the clip spread rapidly across major platforms. Hashtags Casey lied and Justice for Imani exploded in reach. Older posts by Casey Rudd were re-examined, frame by frame, exposing how she had cut out moments that could have supported Imani. Former critics deleted comments. Some issued public apologies. Public opinion turned. The fury no longer pointed at Imani but at the one who had manipulated the public's view. News outlets that had run biased stories updated their headlines. Some deleted articles, others added disclaimers, but the damage had already been done. Casey's YouTube channel lost over a third of its subscribers within 24 hours. Brands that once sponsored her withdrew, issuing curt statements saying they do not tolerate distortion of truth. Inside her apartment, Imani scrolled through the headlines. Her eyes were still, showing neither satisfaction nor relief. She didn't share the video, didn't post a thank you, and offered no rebuttal. People called her Silent Grace, but she knew it was our more unnecessary shell to keep herself from breaking under what had long festered beneath the surface. Jerome texted her a link to an online article comparing Casey's edited video with the original Airwitness footage. He added one line, "They're starting to see what I tried to shield you from." She read it, then put down her phone. Without replying, she opened her laptop and sent a brief email to Marcus titled, "On the recently verified clip." She wrote, "The truth is now visible, but the wound hasn't healed. Apologies. Can't undo the silence that judged me. I will continue." After hitting send, she sat quietly for a long time, eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, the sky darkened, the streets below flowing like a feed, turning, swelling, thick with unverified noise. But for the first time in days, she no longer felt swallowed. One thought settled firmly. If truth can be seen, then silence must also be illuminated, and she would be the one to step into that light first. Casey Rudd's clarification video appeared soon after, featuring her with full makeup, a soft-lit background, and a carefully moderated tone. She thanked viewers for their feedback on the previous clip and spoke with sugary defensiveness. She claimed the rush of editing caused some parts to be omitted and denied any intent to harm. Her phrasing, misunderstood, and lack of post-production control framed the 10-minute video more as strategic deflection than apology. She never once admitted Imani had been wronged, only that, if anyone felt hurt, please understand the pressure I'm under. Less than 30 minutes after the video went live, a Reddit post analyzing its metadata appeared under the name Cypherglass, known for exposing high-profile content manipulation online. The post outlined how Casey downloaded the video, edited out the altercation between Darren and Imani, and detailed file history, timestamps, and notes. Cypherglass concluded, "This wasn't a post-production error. This was a choice." Dozens of follow-up posts emerged. Users dug into Casey's content history, uncovering past allegations of plagiarism and misrepresented sources. In some clips, she spliced others' words to match her narrative. In others, she promoted products without disclosing they were samples. Videos once hailed as "for justice" now served as evidence of her downfall. Public opinion shifted again. Comments once used to discredit Imani turned into public corrections. One user wrote, "I believed Casey because she used the tone I like. Now I know tone means nothing." Imani's inbox overflowed with apologies, prompting her assistant to begin filtering them. Still, she remained silent. No stories, no public statements. Even press inquiries were left unanswered. A former friend messaged not to ask how she was, but to admit, "You stayed silent and still made the world rethink how it sees people like us." At the airport's headquarters, the Internal Communications Board called an emergency meeting. They began reviewing all collaborations with private content creators filming in security zones. Casey's case reminded them, unofficial footage, once viral, could unravel more than an official bulletin ever could. A content review committee was formed, tasked not only with oversight but with a deeper question: who controls the narrative? That night, as the city calmed after a storm, Imani sat by the window flipping through a notebook lined with post-it notes. She turned to a blank page and wrote in plain handwriting, "No emphasis, no date. Truth may not need a microphone, but liars always wear theirs tightly. She closed the notebook, but the sentence hung in her mind. It was time to shift roles, from the one filmed to the one framing the lens. And this time, no one would cut her voice mid-sentence. Marcus Green closed the folder, the desk lamp casting harsh light on his weary eyes. For over a week, the investigation he led had been squeezed tighter by veiled threats and a string of internal emails that politely reminded him to know when to stop. Even his closest colleagues began keeping their distance. He used to believe in the system, in the standards he had followed for nearly 20 years. But the deeper he went, the more it resembled a stage than a place where justice was carried out. His phone screen lit up with a message. No name, no profile photo, just a single line. I have what you need. Meet me. Basement level P4. Marcus glanced at the clock, then stood, removed the SIM card, tucked the phone into his drawer, and took only a blank notebook and a wooden pencil. He wasn't sure if this was a trap, a test from within, or his last shot at breaking through the wall he'd been hitting for weeks. The basement was silent, overhead lights casting sharp shadows against the concrete. The figure in front of him became clearer. Mintron stood with hands in the pockets of a thin coat, no longer hesitant like the last time they met. Marcus approached and nodded. Min didn't say much. He pulled out a small silver USB. No bigger than a pinky. I don't have much time, he whispered, but this will explain why she was targeted. Marcus accepted the USB, eyes pausing on Min's tired face. Internal recording, Min added, from a closed-door meeting with the Security Advisory Board. I backed it up before they transferred me. They think I follow orders. Marcus replied quietly, you know if I use this, you'll be implicated. Min gave a crooked smile. I've stayed silent too long, he exhaled. Just promise you won't let go when the system tightens the noose. They didn't shake hands or make promises. Only a heavy glance passed between them before they turned away. Back in his car, Marcus plugged the USB into his personal laptop, put on his headphones, and opened the first file. The voice came through, crisp and unnerving. An older man, clearly from the advisory board, spoke into a conference mic. Don't waste checks on stakeholders. They cause unnecessary trouble and sometimes have lawyers behind them. We need clean numbers, enough to justify the budget and maintain security metrics. Every scan of a regular civilian is an easy statistic, easy to report, easy to classify. Another voice interrupted. What if the subject is black or an immigrant? The first voice replied without hesitation, all the better. They rarely have anyone backing them. Marcus leaned back, fists clenched around the steering wheel. His suspicions had become proof. This wasn't misconduct by one rogue officer, it was coordinated, systemized, with clear rationale and budget-driven motives. Imani's story wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a structure of bias, designed for metrics and shielded by the silence of people like he used to be. He closed his eyes not to rest, but to prepare. The office coffee maker hadn't been turned on. The overhead light spilled across the empty desk like the room itself was holding its breath. Marcus walked in with his coat slung over his shoulder, holding 2 encrypted USBs. He sat, connected the device, and played the audio from the confidential meeting. His former superior's voice rang flat from the computer speakers. Don't waste time on non-strategic profiles. Focus on those who pose elevated risk. Marcus frowned. His face no longer showed outrage, just a chilling stillness. He sent a message to Imani. You should hear this. I don't know how long I can keep it. The message changed to seen within seconds. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, but soon faded. He knew time was slipping. Backup protocols ran in parallel, duplicating the files to a secondary hard drive and another portable device. Once completed, Marcus stood, pacing slowly. On the bulletin board, he spotted a handwritten note. Just do it. It's time. The handwriting was Caleb's, someone who had kept silent in every meeting until now. Within the security unit, a few colleagues who once nodded indifferently now greeted him with quiet purpose. No one said it aloud, but the way they stood, the way they looked at him, something had shifted. Someone placed a coffee mug silently by his window. a quiet kind of support. Marcus sent the first email to the Federal Investigative Committee, attaching the file and citations. The system responded within minutes. Transfer failed. Unknown error. He tried again, this time through a network of independent journalists. Another failure. His expression darkened. The firewall wasn't just software, it had been embedded into the airport's internal systems. His instincts led him back to his office. The door was still locked, but the drawer had been forced open. The backup drive in his folder was gone. The screen was black, like it had never been used. He stayed silent, drew a deep breath, and retrieved the final copy from his coat. This device never left his person, the last shard of truth not yet erased. He headed straight to the third floor. Evelyn Monroe's office lights were off, but her internal mailbox outside remained accessible. He placed the device into the clear tray, along with a brief, handwritten note. No signature, no date, just a few careful lines. Evelyn, you once said not everyone can stay silent forever. I believe you were never truly silent. Back in his own office, Marcus folded his coat and gathered his personal items. While shutting down the computer, he left a note on the desk. The handwriting was firm, in blue ink. If I disappear, don't look for me, just release the truth. The office door closed behind him without a sound, but from within, something had already begun to move. The office building housing the legal team of Citizens for Fair Transit wasn't anything remarkable. The sign was faded, the hallway quiet, and the scent of old documents seeped through every crack. But that morning, each person entered with a different posture. They were no longer passengers stranded in airports. Now, they were plaintiffs. They had names, stories, and for the first time, someone willing to listen. The first to speak was Nora Bennett, a single mother who had been detained with her 7-year-old son. She recalled the public baggage search, the sound of her son's crying still etched in her memory. Next came Kareem Saleh, an IT student who described being forced to stand facing a wall with arms outstretched, simply because his name resembled a vague entry on some list. Arvind Patel, lead engineer at a medical device firm, brought the room to stillness when he shared how he'd been held for 5 hours, missed an international meeting, and received only a careless apology from a supervisor whose name he never learned. The evidence was laid out clearly: recordings from internal meetings, copied internal reports, and strange emails from anonymous sources. Marcus Green's name wasn't mentioned, but everyone in the room knew most of the materials came from the one who vanished from the system like a final flicker before darkness took over. Imani arrived late and sat at the end of the table, separated from the unfolding narratives. When the lawyer asked whether she sought compensation in the lawsuit, she shook her head. "I'm just a witness," she said. "I was there the day it all came to light, but this story started long before me." The expressions of those seated across from her grew somber. They remembered how she stood calmly in that airport hallway when the system turned its back. Now she sat among those who had chosen, at last, to speak up. The lawsuit's filing stretched 36 pages, signed by 12 individuals. The attorney carrying the folder stepped out of the room into sunlight, gripping the paperwork tightly. The case was no longer an isolated mishap or a procedural error. It had become a pattern repeated through organized silence. That afternoon, Imani left the office holding a summary copy of the filing. She read each line, recalling Darren's face when confronted by her father, Evelyn's eyes when she received the backup device, and the final message Marcus had left behind. Something inside her shifted, not quite anger, not quite hope. It felt like a wire stretched too long, beginning to fray. Social media still hadn't settled. Some praised, others criticized, and among them were anonymous insults sent to her email. One comment read, "Would she have dared do this if she weren't rich?" She didn't respond. Some things needed no reply. The lawsuit's existence was answer enough. That night, the front page of the New York Chronicle carried an exclusive. The bold headline read, "They held us because we didn't look like what they expected." Beneath it, a photograph of the 12 plaintiffs standing tall, eyes facing the lens, tired, bruised, but unbowed. The JFK Terminal press room was packed with journalists. On a long table covered in white cloth sat 2 active microphones. A large screen behind displayed the airport authority's logo. The spokesperson sat center stage in a white shirt and gray tie, each gesture precise to the millimeter. When the flashes dimmed, he spoke in a measured tone. "We reject all allegations of profiling. There is no policy targeting any ethnicity. All screening follows automated systems, free of discriminatory input. His words were quickly drowned by a barrage of questions. A young reporter from an independent network stood up, holding a printed transcript from a leaked audio file. If that's true, how do you explain this line, "Focus on those who don't match financial profiles"? It came from your internal security advisor, with verified signature. A pause stretched half a beat before the spokesperson adjusted the mic. We are reviewing the recording's authenticity. Until verification is complete, we will refrain from further comment. The press conference spiraled. Each denial fueled more pressure. Major outlets began citing Jonas Ray's independent report, which analyzed 2 years of internal data. Over 78% of secondary screenings involved passengers who were Black or had South or East Asian names. The figure was far too skewed to be called random. Evelyn Monroe sat in her private office, following every update on her personal monitor. She said nothing, but the landline rang more frequently. Some journalists left messages, asking about her time working with Marcus. Her name began appearing in speculative pieces, a senior source believed to hold decisive evidence. She held the storage device in her hand, as if it were a verdict waiting to be rendered. Meanwhile, Imani continued receiving messages in her private inbox. Some were heartfelt thanks from people who had long stayed silent, thinking their stories meant nothing. But shadows lingered among them. A handwritten letter was slid through her door. White paper, smeared red ink spelling, "You've gone too far. No sender, no trace." She folded the letter and placed it in the right drawer, locking it, not out of fear, but as if marking a point of no return. Night fell slowly across the high-rise apartment, streetlights casting long bands of gold across the wooden floor. Imani sat at her desk, laptop glowing, an inbox full of unread messages. On her phone screen, a message from Marcus reappeared like an old scar. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep it." She reread it, slowly, as if for the first time. Below his words stretched a long blank Spacino updates, no reply. She placed her fingers on the keyboard and opened a new email. The recipient field remained empty. In the subject line, the words appeared, deliberate and brief. "I'll tell it from the beginning." The wind howled through the window crack. Outside, the city kept moving. But in that moment, everything seemed to hold still behind her hands. Imani stared at the screen, unblinking. She knew what came next was no longer just her story. And if those behind the system were watching, she wanted them to see this. The voice of someone once labeled an exception, now ready to document their entire unwritten code. The 8th floor meeting room had been cleared early that morning. Curtains were drawn over the glass walls, and nameplates of the disciplinary board members were neatly arranged. Marcus Green sat facing them, with no one standing behind him. On the table lay a folder marked with a red underlined title, "Violation of Data Confidentiality Protocol." A silver-haired man, voice steady like a weather forecast, restated the purpose of the session: the decision to suspend Marcus for unauthorized handling and dissemination of unreviewed data. "Did you share any files outside the system?" The voice was firm, not loud. Marcus met the speaker's eyes and remained silent. No confirmation, no denial. His hands rested still on his knees. No one across the table waited for more. The decision was signed on the spot, no legal counsel, no witness testimony recorded. Everything proceeded as if it had been scripted beforehand. One board member quietly gathered the documents, while 2 others avoided looking at him as they exited. Marcus walked into the hallway, shoulders relaxed, eyes not searching for anyone. The office buzzed with murmurs. A few former colleagues averted their gaze. Some shut their doors more gently than usual when he passed. Only Emma, the administrative secretary, approached in silence, brushed past him, and slipped a folded paper into his coat pocket before disappearing down the hall. Marcus paused and unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, slightly tilted. "Don't let them extinguish what you've lit." He folded the note and tucked it into the black notebook he always used for internal records. His ID badge had to be surrendered at the gate. He handed it over without a word. The guard scanned it. The light turned red, and the screen displayed a deactivated status. Marcus gave a slight nod and walked away. No footsteps followed. No one waited ahead. But he knew the files had been sent. Before going to the meeting, he had contacted the only remaining channel with authority, a representative from the Federal Aviation Human Rights Commission. They confirmed receipt, promised encryption, and forwarded the data to the priority task group. As he stepped along the cold sidewalk, Marcus felt lighter. No title to uphold, no command to obey. He reached for the draft report in his satchel document that detailed systemic violations, an internal passenger classification list, and statistics revealing disproportionate scrutiny of those who didn't fit the financial image standard. The ID badge was now a meaningless piece of plastic, but that report was the reason he hadn't slept well in months. Now, free from the silence-bound hierarchy, he understood his role more clearly than ever. Not an insider anymore, but someone who had stepped outside to speak for those still held back by wrong appearances. As he passed the security gate, the afternoon light stretched a long shadow behind him. In his left hand, the report was clenched firmly. Each page marked another step toward the truth, and he knew, from this point on, the truth would no longer stand alone. The office sat on the third floor of an old Brooklyn building, nestled among modest agencies with a small sign that read, Federal Aviation Human Rights Commission, Independent Investigations Division. No uniformed guards, no fingerprint scanners, but every person who entered carried information heavy enough to shift the course of history. Marcus was greeted with a firm handshake, a brief introduction, and eyes that did not probe. Dr. Mara Chen was the first to invite him to sit. Her dark hair was tied back, a muted shirt layered under a worn cardigan, her voice calm and low. She didn't waste time on empty questions. When Marcus placed the USB on the table, she simply nodded and signaled a technician to back up the data. A diagram of operational procedures appeared on the screen behind her. Mara said, "We've been waiting for someone to step out of the system. We didn't expect it to be you." Marcus said nothing. He began laying out everything. Audit logs, secretly encrypted, internal classification codes that made no sense unless you were inside, and audio recordings from meetings with statements so blatant they left no room for interpretation. Phrases like, prioritize those prone to recognition errors, and don't waste time on high-profile first-class clients, now rested in quiet files, ready to be played when the time came. After nearly 3 hours, Mara addressed her team. This material is sufficient to initiate a preliminary hearing. The question is no longer whether a problem exists, but how wide the damage spreads. They began scheduling a strategic meeting, bringing together 2 major media outlets, a policy advocacy group, and legal representatives for the plaintiffs who had just filed suit. The matter was no longer theoretical, it had moved into motion. Marcus leaned by the meeting room window, eyes scanning the street below. Traffic moved as if nothing had changed, but he knew otherwise. Here, in this modest room with a few silent people, a system had begun to tremble. He no longer carried a title, no longer belonged on a payroll. His place was now between justice and silence, and this time he had chosen to advance. Before leaving the office, Marcus checked his phone. A message had just come in from Evelyn Monroe. The text was brief. "I'm ready. If you release it, I'll confirm." He paused for a moment, rereading the words. It wasn't just a promise, it was the final commitment that sealed all prior choices. He walked out of the building, the wind stirring the trees, clouds thick above the city. He looked up at the swirling gray, as if searching his own resolve in its reflection. His fingers moved across the phone screen, typing slowly, then stopping. The message sent was this: "We no longer belong to the old system. Now, we are the new ones." And for the first time in years, Marcus smiled, not because he felt relief, but because he knew the door had opened, and this time, it wasn't for the powerful, but for the unyielding. Evelyn Monroe sat upright in the worn leather chair, the dim ceiling light casting shadows across a face usually composed, now lined with tension. The small office was buried deep in the technical sublevel of JFK Airport, far from the noise of passengers and removed from the system she had once helped operate. On the desk lay a thick stack of files: Marcus Green's report, internal disciplinary records she had once signed, Mintrans recorded audio, and a list of incidents marked "no clear signs of misconduct." A loudspeaker announced the final flight of the day, but Evelyn heard only the fracturing sound within herself. Her eyes fixed on the oldest complaint in the pile, where a young black passenger had been detained for hours without a clear cause. Back then, she had signed the conclusion everyone expected. The case was closed, with no media attention, no deep inquiry, and no accountability. She remembered the boy's eyes as he left the inspection area, not angry, not pleading, just quietly asking, "Why?" and she had looked away. For years, Evelyn told herself she hadn't done anything wrong. Every decision had followed protocol. Every case had been closed following administrative guidelines. But now, the revelations shattered that shell of logic piece by piece. Marcus had dared to ask questions. Min Tran had been reassigned. Imani Carter had stepped forward publicly without invoking her father's name for protection. Meanwhile, Evelintha, one in a position to stop it all from the beginning, had always chosen silence. Slowly, Evelyn picked the desk phone and dialed her longtime personal attorney, the same man who had supported her since her early supervisory days. His voice was familiar and reassuring, but when Evelyn asked the question, silence poured in cold and hollow. "If I speak up now, am I betraying myself?" No answer came. She didn't wait for one. Hanging up, she opened her laptop, logged into the internal system, and accessed the federal reporting portal. The interface was familiar: blank fields to fill, document attachments, and a final line affirming that all submitted information was truthful and voluntary. Her hands moved slowly, dragging each file into the upload section. Min's recording, internal emails between commanding officers and regional managers, audit tables of ethnicity-based screening all included. The cursor hovered over the submit button. The room felt thick, time suspended at the edge of a single breath. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and looked directly at the screen. "Some things can't be cleansed with a promotion," she whispered, not for anyone to hear, but to sever the thread of self-deception she had followed for years. She hadn't clicked submit, but everything was ready. In that moment, silence was no longer protection, but a stain, and she knew just one more step, and Evelyn Monroe would no longer stand behind the system, but with the people. Evelyn walked the long corridor, her stride steady, unrushed. In her bag was a sealed envelope and a silver USB drive. The morning light passed through dew-speckled glass, reflecting softly off nameplates lining the offices. She didn't stop at the security station or her usual desk. Instead, she headed to the end of the hallway, where a new nameplate marked the office of the acting captain, temporarily replacing Marcus during his suspension. The door opened with a soft knock. The man inside raised an eyebrow, gesturing for her to come in. On the desk, his planner remained unopened, the computer still off. Evelyn placed the envelope and USB on the surface, then took a seat across from him. Her gaze was calm, her posture straight. She gave no introduction or justification. She simply said, "I request an immediate meeting with a representative from the Federal Inspector General's office. This cannot be delayed." 2 hours later, a small conference room on the security compliance floor was quieter than usual. 3 people sat across from Evelyn, including a representative from the Anti-Discrimination Commission and a civil rights auditor from the Federal Oversight Division. She began by explaining how unwritten directives were passed verbally through generations of supervisors, from her predecessor to her. These instructions were always delivered with a certain tone, like an unspoken rule, and everyone understood they were to be followed to keep their jobs. She opened her file, pointing to data charts showing random checks over the past 3 years, revealing a disproportionate number of screenings for passengers of certain ethnic traits. There were no direct orders, but the screening lines had been trained to follow instincts cultivated through subtle reinforcement across shifts. The USB contained internal emails, shift memos, and benchmarks for ideal screening ratios in sensitive zones, all veiled in neutral administrative language. One representative asked, "Has anyone ever challenged this?" Evelyn nodded, mentioning Min Tran, who had voiced concerns during a closed meeting. He was later reassigned under the pretext of staff restructuring. Imani Carter's case was a catalyst, but not the only one. On the table was a list of at least 8 other cases Evelyn had personally reviewed, all concluded as no apparent misconduct. Her voice carried no apology, no collapse, but something in her eyes quieted the room. "I used to think I was preserving the efficiency of a functioning system. In truth, I was upholding intentional silence, and if I don't start breaking that now, I am part of it." As she exited the meeting room, Evelyn didn't look back. She left behind everything she could offer. Her composure was not that of someone who had been advised, but of someone who could no longer stomach passing by injustice and calling it protocol. A week later, the evening news included a brief segment. A senior supervisor at JFK had filed an official discrimination complaint related to passenger screening procedures. No name was mentioned, no photo shown, But on a quiet afternoon, Imani Carter stepped onto her porch, where a crooked mailbox clung to the wooden siding. Inside was a pale gray envelope, no return address, no sender's name. She opened it to find a handwritten line in blue ink. "I am not a good person, but I chose to do the right thing. E.M." She folded the letter and looked up. The wind was shifting, and so was the truth. Imani stood behind the glass doors of the hall, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The late morning light filtered through sheer curtains, casting a soft golden hue over rows of seated attendees. She walked directly to the small wooden podium at the center of the room, gripping a folded piece of paper tightly in her hand. No one introduced her. There was no applause, and no slogan hanging behind. But the room fell completely silent as she looked directly at them and spoke softly. "I'd like to share a short story." There were no camera flashes, only her voice, steady and clear. Imani recounted the flight from Chicago. She described the moment she booked the ticket with her own account, the suit she had carefully chosen for a conference on sustainable investment. Every detail had been meticulously planned. But the one thing she couldn't have prepared for was the very first look she received after stepping out of the first-class cabine, a gaze filled with doubt. Her voice remained low but firm. "I used to think that if I dressed properly, acted professionally, and showed all the right documents, I would be treated with respect. I overestimated the power of logic in a world that favors assumptions." The people in the room seemed to hold their breath. No one interrupted. No one took notes. They just listened. Imani didn't name anyone. She didn't accuse or assign blame. She admitted she once thought she was strong enough to shrug it off. But after reading messages from strangers, those who had lived through almost the exact same experiences, he realized something. Silence from someone who has the privilege to be heard can cut deeper than anything for those who never get the chance to speak. She held up a thin folder, raising it to eye level. Each page inside contained a short account, sometimes just a single line. "Held for 3 hours. No explanation. They searched my bag 3 times. I traveled with my white colleague. Only I was asked for proof of financial standing." These lines were not released for attention, nor were they hidden out of shame. They came from nameless individuals, quiet but unmistakably alive in every word. Imani scanned the room without once looking away. Her eyes carried no anger, but something else's. If she were finally unloading a burden she'd carried too long without finding a place to set it down. "I'm not an activist. I don't see myself as a special victim. I'm just someone who walked through an airport hallway and realized people didn't see me. They saw an assumption." Her final sentence didn't rise in volume. It dropped like a stone soft, but weighty. "I don't represent anyone. I just can't pretend not to see anymore." No one clapped, but the silence that followed held more power than any standing ovation. In that small room, perhaps for the first time, people didn't see Imani as an isolated case. They saw themselves as someone they had once overlooked, and from that moment, something shifted. Camera lights shone on Imani's face, highlighting the sharp lines of her cheekbones and the unwavering focus of her gaze toward the press row. A young reporter in the front stood up, voice steady but cautious. "Do you plan to sue Officer Darren Kessler or the airport management?" Imani didn't flinch or hesitate. Her answer came with a quiet force. "I don't need revenge if what I do can stop the next person from being treated like a stranger in their own country." That response halted journalists mid-keystroke, not out of shock, but because the tone in her voice carried something greater than hurt. Another reporter shifted the topic. "There's word that Mr. Jerome Carter is being questioned by shareholders for allowing you to speak publicly. Any comment on that?" Imani inhaled, staring into the lens as if speaking to someone specific. "If he loses his position because his daughter chose dignity, at least I didn't let him down." The atmosphere thickened. People looked at each other, not to confirm the answer, but to reflect it back onto themselves. Those who had stayed quiet for safety, bowed for stability, or remained silent to preserve status. One more question was asked, this time not about family or data. A graying journalist posed it gently. "What would you say to those who were part of that system, but now wonder if they can change?" Imani didn't answer right away. She lowered her head briefly, then raised it again. "There's someone, I won't name her, who once helped keep that machine running. She could have stayed silent and safe, but she chose to shut it down with her bare hands. No one asked her to. No one promised to protect her afterward, but she did it anyway. Imani looked across the room, where flickering lights bounced off the faces of those quietly listening. Change doesn't come from the innocent. It comes from those who once knew they were wrong, stayed silent, and one day realized they couldn't anymore. The press room grew heavy, as if each word she spoke settled onto every page, every screen. Someone turned on a secondary camera too late, catching her from an angle that showed both her hands clenched behind the podium, OT from fear, but as if holding herself together beneath so many stares. Imani closed the press conference with a memory never previously shared. In high school, I dreamed of becoming a diplomat, not because I wanted to represent a nation, but because I wanted to learn how to make people listen through words, not power. I never imagined my first public speech would be like this. She paused, lips tightening slightly as if to anchor her final thought. Then, in the clearest voice she had used all morning, Imani ended, "I don't hope to be a symbol. I just hope that next time, when a black girl stands at a security checkpoint, people don't see her as a surprise." The room stood still, and in that moment, no one held a pen, no one typed. They had stopped recording and started understanding. The office door let out a soft click as Marcus pushed it open. Everything inside was just as he remembered. The framed photo of a runway at sunset, the small plant by the window freshly watered, everything so neatly arranged it made him pause. The desk was dusted, the hard drive replaced, and a cup of coffee still steaming sat to the right of the keyboard. No one said anything as he walked through the administrative wing, but the subtle nods, the glances that lingered for half a second before moving on, said more than any formal welcome. Some forms of respect are only spoken through silence. His reinstatement notice had been sent through internal email at the same time as the official announcement from the Aviation Human Rights Council. It was brief, stripped of embellishment. Darren Kessler's status had been updated to terminated in the personnel system, the note citing a serious breach of professional conduct and damage to the organization's credibility. The news spread within a morning. Some sighed, others exchanged knowing looks, as if the ending, though delayed, had always been inevitable. On a public forum, Casey Rudd lost access a few days later. Moderators confirmed he had shared doctored footage, purposefully edited and misleading. Those who once reposted his clip quietly took it down. But for Imani, Marcus, and the many who never had a camera to prove their truth, the damage had already been measured in suspicion, not engagement metrics. That afternoon, Marcus opened his personal email. A new message had arrived from a name he barely recognized. Alex, the night shift security staff. The text appeared slowly, each word feeling like a deliberate tap of confession. "I used to be afraid to speak, but since you left, I started writing down everything I saw. No one's asked yet, but I've begun to record it." Marcus read it 4 times. There were no thanks, no promises, just a quiet message that silence had begun to crack. Over the weekend, a quiet farewell was held for Evelyn Monroe. No speeches, no cake, no candles. She removed her nameplate herself, packed her papers into a worn leather bag, her eyes just as sharp as the day Marcus first stepped into her command. Before leaving, she stood beside him and said softly, "Sometimes, the only way to take responsibility is to step out and let someone else step in." Then she walked away without looking back. The door closed behind her like the end of a long chapter of silence, now handed to someone else to carry. When reporters met Marcus at the exit to ask how it felt to be reinstated, he didn't deflect. Standing between mirrored glass panels, he looked out toward the tarmac and said simply, "I didn't reclaim my dignity. I just took back what should never have been taken." No smile, no bravado, just the upright posture of a man who always knew his worth, didn't need anyone's confirmation, and from that posture, what was stolen had returned to where it belonged. The ceiling lights at JFK still shone white, the signs still blinked in turns, and announcements still echoed through crowds. Nothing about the space had changed except for what had shifted behind people's eyes. Imani Carter stepped into the security checkpoint, ticket in hand, coat neatly folded, eyes steady. No one stopped her, no call to halt, no alerts from any machine. She wasn't searching for eyes, nor dodging them, but she knew something had changed. A young female TSA officer, brown-skinned and clear-eyed, gave her a subtle nod when their gazes met. No greeting, no smile, just a nod that carried the weight of recognition. Imani returned it, brief but certain. not out of politeness, but as a quiet signal shared by those who've once been pierced by unconscious judgment. The hallway to the first-class lounge was nearly empty. She sat by the window, surrounded by the muted rhythm of footsteps and rolling luggage, a soundtrack to the thoughts building inside her. She opened her purse and pulled out a worn photo. In it, a 10-year-old girl in a school uniform stood in front of a world map, holding a plastic airplane. The girl was smiling, with the kind of smile untouched by questions like, "How did you get that seat?" Imani stared at the photo for a few seconds, then folded it back and slid it into a notebook filled with notes. The last page held a single line, "Not every dream needs approval." She closed the book, her palm still warm from the photo. There was no triumphant outburst, only the quiet sense that something had finally returned to where it belonged. A woman nearby approached hesitantly. She was black, slender, and clutching her bag strapped tightly. She stopped in front of Imani, eyes brimming with emotion. "I know who you are," she said softly. "I was held here last year. Because of you, I told my daughter what happened. Thank you." Imani nodded, her voice nearly a whisper. "Next time, I hope no one has to know who I am and still be allowed to walk through." The woman pressed her lips together, then turned and walked toward gate 22 with a noticeably different presence. In that quiet moment, Imani didn't feel like the center of anything. She was just a woman about to board a plane. But this time, there was nothing to prove, no need to call her father, no one asking for extra documents. She packed her things, rolled her suitcase, and walked toward the boarding gate. Each step felt deliberate, not about victory, but about stance. Behind her, an older security guard watched, eyes fixed on her form. He had seen many pass through that hallway, witnessed rage, submission, but he had never seen anyone walk that straight after once being forced to stop at that very place. The last thought in Imani's mind as she entered the jet bridge wasn't grand. It came quietly but firmly, like the final period in a silent declaration. Dignity doesn't come from the seat or your father's name. It comes from how you stand when no one stands with you. And this time, no one blocked her path, but there were many, in many places, standing behind her. There are moments in life when the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard, it just needs to stand still and wait for the light to reach it. Imani Carter's story isn't simply about a security check or a misread threat. It is a quiet testament to the persistent, systemic biases that operate like machinery until someone calm enough begins peeling them back layer by layer. Imani didn't need rage to be heard. She didn't need power to resist. It was her calm persistence amid judgment that revealed the truth. From this story, we learn never to judge someone based on their skin, name, or appearance. A person's true worth lies in how they hold their dignity under pressure, and ultimately, justice, even when distorted or delayed, always finds a way back. Have you ever been misjudged simply because someone didn't understand you? Have you ever been underestimated, only to prove yourself quietly stronger than they imagined? If this story made you think, share it so others can reflect too. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and shed light on what often remains unseen in today's society.